history. In the end he had been defeated, but he had always escaped his pursuers. His armies had long since been disbanded, but he had still survived in those countries of the eastern Mediterranean that had not yet yielded to Rome. He had warned all their rulers that unless they continued to fight against Rome, they would all, one by one, lose their freedom. Now, at the close of his life, he lived at the village of Libissa on a quiet inlet from the sea leading towards the Bithynian capital, Nicomedia. Although Hannibal was the guest of Prusias, he had been careful to live outside the city, for he had no wish to call attention to himself. He knew that he had been declared throughout the known world an enemy of the Romans, and that no man, no king, no country was allowed to give him shelter. Prusias, in far Bithynia, had dared to do so, thinking that his country was so remote from Rome, or even from its ever-growing shadow, that Hannibal could remain unobserved. The king needed the advice of this famous soldier-statesman on the reorganization of his kingdom. Then Bithynia found itself engaged in a war with Pergamum, that prosperous city in Asia Minor which had become a client of the Roman state. The forces of Prusias were badly defeated, and he turned to Hannibal for advice. The latter would have been wise, however difficult it might have been, to avoid acting as counselor to a king who was engaged against a client of the all-conquering Romans. But he had dedicated himself since the age of 9 at an altar in distant Carthage, never to be a friend of the Roman people. Hannibal managed to change the course of the war and secure a victory for Bithynia at sea. It involved a stratagem so ingenious that the men of Pergamum, when they encountered it, were completely demoralized, broke off the action, and fled. It had occurred to Hannibal that in the semi-open vessels of that time, where the oarsmen were naked and even the marines were only lightly clad, nothing could be more fearsome than the explosion on board of bombs of poisonous snakes. The countryside of Bithynia was scoured for them, and they were then packed in slithery heaps inside pottery jars. When the two fleets engaged, and the jars bursting on the decks of the opposing ships released their venomous contents, there was widespread panic, and the Bithynians secured their victory. Rome, like all imperial powers, depended upon the smaller states that fell within its orbit feeling secure, and Rome was not used to her allies and clients being defeated. Shortly after this incident, the envoys of King Prusias were summoned to Rome to explain why they were at war with Pergamum in the first place. The king had kept Hannibal's presence in his country secret, but one of the envoys was not so discreet. The Roman Senate at once declared that this enemy of their people must be surrendered. Flamininus, a Roman general distinguished in affairs of the East, heard of Hannibal's whereabouts and determined that the Carthaginian should never escape again as he had so often in the past. Hannibal must be tracked down and captured or killed, in the words of Plutarch, like a bird that has grown too old to fly and lost its tail feathers. Hannibal had long known what his fate would be if the Romans ever laid hands upon him. In a just cause, as he saw it, he had made war upon them for their infamous treatment of Carthage at the conclusion of an earlier war. He had taken an army right through Spain and into what is now France, crossed the river Rhone, traversed the Alps at a time of the year when no one believed it possible, and invaded Italy. For 15 years he had used Italy as his battlefield and his home, destroying Roman armies with almost contemptuous ease. Hearing now from his servants that his house was surrounded by soldiers, he is said to have remarked, "It is now time to end the anxiety of the Romans. Clearly they are no longer able to wait for the death of an old man who has caused them so much concern." His irony mocked his enemies to the last. When the Romans burst into the house, they found their great adversary lying dead. Even in his very end, he had eluded them. Chapter 1. A Disputed World. The dark giant lay sprawled.